The invisible prison. Have you ever stood at a crossroads, knowing exactly what you wanted, feeling it in your bones, hearing it loud and clear in the deepest part of yourself, and then done the complete opposite? Have you ever felt a powerful current pulling you in one direction, only to find yourself drifting somewhere else entirely, as if an invisible hand had quietly redirected your life without asking permission? Have you ever made a decision and felt a strange unease afterward? Not guilt exactly, but something quieter, something heavier? A sense that the choice wasn't really yours? Maybe it showed up like this. You changed what you said because you were afraid of what someone might think. You stayed silent when you had something real to say. You smiled when you didn't mean it. You agreed when everything inside you disagreed. You shrank yourself, your opinions, your ambitions, your truth, just to avoid the risk of losing someone's approval. And here's the most unsettling part. You probably didn't even notice you were doing it. This is not a character flaw. This is not weakness. This is not something broken inside you. What you have been experiencing is one of the most deeply wired psychological patterns in human existence, the relentless, exhausting, invisible drive for approval. And today, we are going to take it apart. Completely. We are going to look at where it comes from, why it is so powerful, what it costs you every single day, and, most importantly, how you can break free from it in a way that is real, lasting, and genuinely life-changing. Because here is the truth that most people never face. The life you are living right now may not actually be yours. It may be a carefully constructed performance, designed not to express who you are, but to manage what others think of you. And the moment you truly understand that, everything changes. The trap begins before you can even name it. Think back to the very beginning. Not your earliest memory exactly, but the emotional architecture of your childhood, the invisible rules that shaped how you learned to exist in the world. When you made someone happy, you were rewarded. When you followed the rules, you were praised. When you caused discomfort, when you said no, when you cried too loudly, when you wanted something inconvenient, the atmosphere changed. The warmth disappeared. The approval vanished. You were not taught this lesson explicitly. Nobody sat you down and said, "Your value depends on how well you manage other people's feelings." But you learned it anyway. Children are extraordinarily perceptive. They read the emotional temperature of a room with frightening accuracy, and they adapt fast. So you adapted. You learned which version of yourself got the warmest response. You learned which emotions were acceptable and which ones needed to be hidden. You learned that being liked felt safe and being disliked felt dangerous. And here is where the trap is set. The brain begins to associate approval with survival, not metaphorically, neurologically. The same reward circuits that light up when you eat when you're hungry, or feel warmth when you're cold. Those circuits also fire when you receive social validation. Approval doesn't just feel good. On a deep biological level, it feels necessary. It feels like oxygen. This is why telling someone to just stop caring what people think is almost laughably unhelpful. You are not dealing with a preference. You are dealing with a deeply embedded survival mechanism that has been reinforced thousands of times across your entire lifetime. But here is what changes everything. Understanding this doesn't trap you further. It actually sets you free. Because once you see the mechanism clearly, you stop being run by it unconsciously. And that awareness, that precise, honest moment of recognition, is where real transformation begins. The moment you first learn to disappear, there is a specific moment. You may not remember it consciously, but it is there, encoded in the body, in the nervous system, in the automatic responses that still govern your behavior decades later. When you first learned that being yourself was not entirely safe, it might have been a moment of genuine rejection. You expressed something real, an emotion, an opinion, a need, and the response you received made it clear that this expression was not welcome. The atmosphere shifted, the warmth withdrew. The approval, which had felt solid and reliable moments before, suddenly became conditional, or it might have been subtler than that. A raised eyebrow, a slight cooling in someone's tone, a silence where encouragement should have been, a look exchanged between adults that you were not supposed to see but did. These microsignals are extraordinarily powerful in childhood when the stakes of social belonging feel existential and the capacity for nuanced interpretation is still developing. You read the signal correctly, and you adapted. This is not pathology. This is intelligence. The problem is not that you developed this capacity. The problem is that it never got updated. The child who learned to suppress anger to maintain parental approval is now an adult who cannot access healthy anger, even when it would be entirely appropriate. The teenager who learned to hide ambition to avoid the social cost of standing out is now a professional who unconsciously sabotages their own advancement. The young person who learned that emotional needs made them burdensome is now someone who cannot ask for help even when they desperately need it. The original learning was adaptive. The continuation is costing you your life. The approval economy you live in. We do not just seek approval in our personal relationships. We live inside an entire economic and social system that is built on the commodification of approval. Social media, the most powerful approval delivery infrastructure ever, constructed, operates on a mechanism that is almost perfectly designed to exploit the approval-seeking brain. Every like, every comment, every share is a unit of social validation delivered on a variable reinforcement schedule. The same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines so compulsive. You never know exactly when the validation is coming, which makes the seeking of it almost impossible to stop. The result is an entire generation whose relationship with approval has been turbocharged to a degree that has no historical precedent. We are not just seeking approval from the people in our immediate social world. We are seeking it from hundreds, sometimes thousands of people simultaneously. We are curating our identities for audiences we have never met. We are experiencing the disapproval of strangers as if it carries the same emotional weight as the disapproval of people who actually know us. This is not a moral failing. It is a predictable response to an extraordinarily powerful set of psychological triggers, deliberately engineered by some of the most sophisticated technologists in human history. Understanding this does not free you from it automatically. Understanding it simply gives you the beginning of agency, the capacity to observe the mechanism rather than be entirely run by it. To notice in any given moment whether the impulse you are experiencing is coming from your authentic self or from the approval-seeking algorithm that has been running in the background since before you could articulate it. That noticing is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. Because freedom does not begin with the absence of the pull. It begins with the awareness of it, the hidden cost nobody talks about. On the surface, seeking approval seems harmless, wanting to be liked, wanting to fit in, wanting to maintain harmony. These feel like reasonable, even admirable impulses. But there is a hidden cost, and it compounds daily. Every time you say yes when you mean no, a small fracture appears between who you are and who you are presenting yourself to be. Every time you silence your real opinion to avoid conflict, that fracture deepens. Every time you shape your personality around what you think someone else wants to see, you drift a little further from your own center. At first, The drift is imperceptible. A word changed here, an opinion softened there, a boundary quietly abandoned. These feel like minor concessions, the reasonable price of social harmony. But over time, the distance grows, and one day you look at your own life and feel a strange sense of disconnection, as if you are watching someone else live it. That feeling is not an illusion, it is information. It is your authentic self sending you a signal that it has been buried for too long. People who chronically seek external approval report significantly higher levels of anxiety, lower self-esteem, greater emotional volatility, and a persistent sense of meaninglessness, even when their lives look successful from the outside, because you can have everything the world says you should want, the career, the relationships, the social recognition, and still feel hollow, that something missing is you, the real you, the exhaustion nobody names. There is a particular kind of tired that approval seekers know intimately. It is not the physical exhaustion of hard work or insufficient sleep. It is not the emotional exhaustion of grief or acute stress. It is something more diffuse, more pervasive, more difficult to name. A low-grade, persistent depletion that accumulates across ordinary days doing ordinary things. It is the exhaustion of performance. Maintaining a self that is not quite yours is work. Continuous, invisible, unconscious work. Every interaction that requires you to manage your presentation, calibrate your expression, monitor the response, and adjust accordingly, is consuming cognitive and emotional resources. This is why so many approval seekers feel most themselves, most rested, most real, most alive in solitude. Not because they are fundamentally introverted, but because solitude is the one context in which the performance can stop. The one space where there is no audience to manage, until you change the habit, not by avoiding connection, but by learning, gradually, imperfectly, with patience and practice, to bring the quality of that solitary authenticity into your engagement with the world, to be as real with others as you are when no one is watching. That is the work, and it is the most worthwhile work available to a human being. Carl Jung and the Architecture of the Trapped Self. To understand why approval-seeking runs so deep and how to genuinely transcend it, we need to go deeper than surface psychology. We need to look at the hidden architecture of the human mind itself, and nobody mapped that architecture more precisely, more courageously, or more profoundly than Carl Gustav Jung. Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who spent his life exploring what he called the unconscious, the vast, largely invisible dimension of the human mind that operates beneath our conscious awareness. Jung believed that most of what drives human behavior does not originate in conscious thought. It originates in the unconscious. The fears that make you hesitate, the patterns that repeat in your relationships, the inexplicable pull toward certain choices, and the inexplicable resistance to others. The approval-seeking that happens automatically before you've even decided to engage in it. These are not random. They are structured, they follow patterns, and those patterns can be understood, mapped, and ultimately transformed. Jung observed that every individual develops what he called a psychological type, a fundamental orientation toward the world that shapes how they perceive reality, process information, and relate to other people. Beyond introversion and extroversion, Jung identified 4 core psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Consider someone whose dominant function is extroverted feeling. Their internal compass is calibrated to the external social world. They read other people's emotions with extraordinary sensitivity. These are beautiful qualities, but they also create a specific vulnerability. When your sense of value is anchored in how others respond to you, You are always at the mercy of responses you cannot control. Jung's insight was radical. Regardless of your psychological type, the approval-seeking mechanism will find a way to infiltrate your unconscious and begin running your behavior. You cannot navigate beyond those tendencies until you can see them clearly. You cannot disrupt an automatic pattern you have never consciously identified. This is why self-knowledge is not a luxury. It is the essential foundation of genuine freedom. The neuroscience of social validation. When you receive social validation, a compliment, a like, an expression of approval from someone whose opinion matters to you, your brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in pleasure, motivation, and reward. The same chemical pathway activated by food, by physical warmth, by success. This is why social media can become compulsive in ways that feel almost physical. Every notification triggers a small dopamine release. The brain learns quickly, seek validation, get reward. Over time, the pattern becomes deeply grooved. But here is what makes this particularly insidious. Dopamine is not released when you get the reward. It is released in anticipation of the reward. The craving itself is the chemical experience. You are not just seeking approval, you are addicted to seeking it. And like any addiction, the tolerance increases over time. You need more validation to feel the same level of reassurance. The benchmark for feeling accepted keeps shifting upward, further out of reach. This is why the approval trap doesn't just stay the same size. It grows. The real question. Underneath everything, most people frame the challenge of approval-seeking as a willpower problem. I just need to stop caring what people think. As if caring were something you could switch off like a light. But Jung pointed to something much more fundamental. The reason approval-seeking is so persistent is that it is not primarily a behavioral problem. It is an identity problem. The approval you seek from others is a substitute for something you have not yet developed internally. A stable, grounded, unconditional relationship with your own worth. When you know, really know in the deepest part of yourself, that your value is not contingent on anyone else's opinion, the need for external approval quietly loses its power. So the real question is not, how do I stop seeking approval? The real question is, how do I develop such a genuine, solid relationship with my own authentic self that I no longer need external validation to feel real? Jung spent his entire life working toward an answer. He called the destination individuation, the process of becoming fully, genuinely, completely oneself. That self is still in you. It has always been in you. And this is how you find your way back to it. A promise and an invitation. In this video, we are going to walk the entire journey together. We will explore Jung's theory of psychological types. We will examine the concept of the persona, the social mask that gradually replaces your authentic face. We will descend into the shadow, the dark, disowned parts of yourself that fuel approval-seeking from beneath the surface. We will look at one of the most extraordinary real-world examples of individuation in modern history, Jung's own rupture with Freud. And we will end with something concrete, practical, grounded, genuinely useful steps for beginning to live from the inside out. This is not easy work. It would be far more comfortable to continue as you are. But there is a question that will not stop asking itself. Do you want to be accepted? Or do you want to be free? Because in the end, you rarely get both. Welcome to the Awakening Library. Part 2. The Mask You Wear. Close your eyes for a moment. Think about the last time you walked into a room full of people, a work meeting, a social gathering, a family dinner, a first date. Think about what happened in the seconds before you crossed that threshold. Did you stand up a little straighter? Did your facial expression shift slightly? Did the words you plan to say change, become a little more careful, a little more polished, a little more calibrated to the audience waiting on the other side of the door? Of course they did, because you are human, and humans do not present one face to the world, they present many. Carl Jung had a name for this phenomenon. He called it the persona, and really understanding it at the level where genuine change becomes possible, might be the single most important step in the journey toward authentic selfhood. What the persona actually is. The word persona comes from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek and Roman theater. These were not decorative accessories. They were functional tools designed to project a character's identity to an audience, to make the role legible from a distance. Jung borrowed the term deliberately, because he saw that human beings engage in precisely this kind of theatrical presentation every day, constructing faces designed to communicate, to signal, to manage the impressions of the people watching. In his landmark work, 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung defined the persona as a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. Designed to make an impression, and designed to conceal. Both simultaneously. Always. This is not cynicism, this is just the honest reality of social existence. We present, we manage, we curate, we perform, not necessarily out of deception, but out of the deeply human need to navigate complex social environments. The persona, in this sense, is not the enemy. It is a tool, a necessary, valuable, even elegant tool for social functioning. The problem is not the mask itself. The problem is when you forget you are wearing one. The moment the mask becomes the face. Imagine an actor who has played the same role for so many years that they can no longer distinguish between themselves and the character. This is what happens to millions of people over the course of an ordinary human life. It does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the accumulation of thousands of small adaptations. You learn early which version of you gets the best response. The agreeable version, the helpful version, the one who never pushes back. And so you begin to lead with that version, first consciously as a strategy, and then unconsciously as a habit, and then so automatically that it stops feeling like a choice at all. It starts to feel like who you are, but it is not who you are. It is who you learn to be in order to stay safe, stay connected, stay approved of. And here is the cruel irony at the heart of the persona trap. The more successfully you maintain the mask, the more invisible the gap between the mask and the real self becomes, not to others, but to you. You have not just hidden yourself from others, you have hidden yourself from yourself. The architecture of your mask. The first layer is laid in childhood. Every child experiments with identity, trying on different behaviors, testing different emotional expressions, and the world responds. Some expressions are met with warmth, others are met with discomfort or correction. The child learns. The behaviors that generate approval get reinforced. The ones that generate disapproval get suppressed. By adolescence, the persona is already substantially formed. The teenager navigates the extraordinarily complex social landscape with a mask that has been years in the making. The pressure to conform intensifies. The cost of deviation feels existential. The mask hardens. By adulthood, the persona is typically so well established that it operates entirely automatically. You don't consciously decide to present your professional self in a job interview. It just happens. The mask deploys itself. And here is where it gets genuinely dangerous. Maintaining a performance that diverges from your authentic self requires continuous psychological effort. Even when you are not aware of performing, some part of you is managing, monitoring, adjusting, calibrating. This is one of the primary reasons so many people feel chronically exhausted without knowing why. Not from overwork, but from the relentless, invisible labor of maintaining a self that is not quite real. The approval machine. Hidden inside the mask, the persona is not just a social convenience. It is, at its core, an approval-generating machine. Every layer of the mask has been calibrated, often unconsciously, always precisely, to maximize social acceptance and minimize social rejection, which means that every time you show up in the world primarily through your persona, you are not actually connecting with other people. You are running an approval optimization program, and the more sophisticated the persona becomes, the deeper the problem, because a highly effective persona generates a lot of approval, and that approval feels wonderful, and so the reward circuit activates, and the behavior is reinforced, and the persona grows stronger, and the authentic self grows quieter, until the day you wake up and realize that the person receiving all that approval is not really you. The relationships built on persona-to-persona connection are not truly intimate. The success achieved through persona performance is not truly satisfying. This is the great persona paradox. The mask that was designed to make you more acceptable has made you less real. The tool that was supposed to protect you has imprisoned you. What gets lost? Behind the mask. Your real opinions disappear, not the opinions you have learned are acceptable. Your actual, genuine, independently formed views on the world, the ones that might make someone uncomfortable, the ones that are actually yours, your real needs disappear. Approval-seeking persona. Wearers become extraordinarily attuned to other people's needs and almost completely disconnected from their own. Your real boundaries disappear. Boundaries require a clear sense of where you end and another person begins. The persona cannot hold firm boundaries because the persona's entire function is to accommodate, to adapt, to avoid friction. Your real emotional experience disappears. Not the emotions you display, those are carefully managed, but the full, raw, unedited emotional reality of your inner life. The anger that seems inappropriate, the grief that feels excessive, the joy that seems embarrassing, all of it gets edited, filtered, performed, and in the process, diminished. And perhaps most importantly, your real potential disappears. Because the persona is built on what has already been approved, it cannot reach for what has not yet been validated. It cannot risk the creativity, the unconventionality, the genuine originality that might generate disapproval before it generates admiration. The persona plays it safe, always, by definition, because safety is its primary function. And a life lived entirely in safety is a life lived at the surface. The masks we inherit. Not all of your persona was constructed through your own experience. Some of it was handed to you, fully formed, pre-assembled, by the people who raised you, the culture that shaped you, the historical moment you were born into. Every family has a social mask, a particular way of presenting itself to the outside world, a set of approved emotions, acceptable ambitions, permitted vulnerabilities. You were inducted into this family persona before you had the developmental capacity to evaluate it or choose whether to adopt it. This inherited persona is often the most difficult layer to recognize and examine, precisely because it predates conscious memory. It feels less like something you adopted and more like something you simply are. Questioning it can feel like a form of disloyalty. But here is what needs to be said with genuine care and genuine firmness. Honoring the people who shaped you does not require perpetuating the parts of their legacy that cost you your authentic self. You can love your family and still choose not to continue performing the family mask. This is not rejection, it is individuation. When other people need your mask, other people are invested in your mask. Not maliciously in most cases, but genuinely. The people in your life have organized their relationship with you around a particular version of you, the version that has been consistent and predictable and manageable. When you begin to change, when the authentic self starts to emerge and the persona starts to loosen, some of the people around you will experience this as threatening. The person who has been relying on your unconditional availability will feel unsettled when you begin to set limits. Their discomfort is real. It deserves compassion. But it cannot be the primary factor governing your choices, because if it is, you will remain exactly where you are indefinitely. The most loving thing you can do for the people in your life in the long run is to be genuinely yourself, because that person is the one they are actually in relationship with, whether they know it yet or not. The question Jung keeps asking, Jung returned again and again to what he considered one of the most urgent questions a human being could face. Who are you when no one is watching? Not the carefully curated version, not the professionally optimized version. Who are you in the silence, in the privacy of your own mind, in the moments before you have calibrated yourself to any particular audience? For many people, perhaps for you, the honest answer is, I am not entirely sure. And that uncertainty is not a character flaw. It is a signal. It is telling you that the persona has been doing so much of the work for so long that the authentic self beneath it has grown unfamiliar. The distance between your persona and your authentic self is the distance between the life you are living and the life you are capable of living. And that distance, however large it has grown, can be closed. The persona is not the enemy. Jung did not view the persona as evil or something to be destroyed. You need a persona. You need the capacity to modulate your self-presentation across different contexts, to read social environments and respond appropriately. The goal is not to tear off all your masks and stand before the world in some kind of radical, unfiltered nakedness. That is not authenticity. That is chaos. The goal is awareness. The goal is to know that you are wearing a mask, to be able to put it on deliberately, use it skillfully, and take it off when it is no longer needed, to be the author of your persona rather than its captive. Jung called the process of moving from captive to author individuation, and we will explore it in depth later in this video. But the first step, always, is simply this: recognizing that the mask exists. Part 3. Meeting your shadow. There is a part of you that you have never introduced to anyone, not because it doesn't exist, not because it is small or insignificant, but because somewhere along the way, in childhood, in adolescence, in the long process of becoming a socially acceptable human being, you learned that this part was not welcome, that it was too much, too dark, too contradictory, too inconvenient for the version of yourself you were trying to present to the world. So you did what any reasonable person does with something unwanted. You hid it. You pushed it down. You buried it beneath layers of politeness and professionalism and carefully managed self-presentation. Carl Jung called this the shadow, and understanding it, genuinely, courageously, honestly understanding it, is not just another step in the journey toward authentic selfhood. It is the step, the one that makes all the others possible. What the shadow actually contains. The shadow, in Jung's framework, is not simply the repository of your worst impulses. It is the repository of everything that got cut off, everything that was deemed unacceptable by your family, your culture, your social group, your own developing sense of what was safe to be. It contains your anger, yes, but it also contains your ambition, your sexuality, your grief, your jealousy, your hunger for things you were told you shouldn't want. And crucially, this is the part that most people miss entirely, it also contains your unlived potential. The creativity you were told was impractical. The strength you were taught was aggression. The sensitivity you learned to read as weakness. All of that is in the shadow, waiting. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is, which means that the more thoroughly you have suppressed the shadow, the more powerful it becomes. The emotions you refuse to feel do not dissolve. They find other outlets, often ones that are far more destructive than the original emotion would have been. How the shadow drives approval seeking here is the connection that unlocks everything. You do not seek approval primarily because you want to be liked. You seek approval primarily because you are afraid of what will happen if the shadow is seen. Think about what approval seeking actually accomplishes at the deepest level. It keeps people at a safe emotional distance, close enough to feel connected, but not close enough to see the unedited version of you. It ensures that no one ever has access to the anger, the need, the jealousy, the ambition, the fear, all the things you have decided are too dangerous to expose. Approval seeking is, at its core, shadow management. And this is why simple behavioral interventions almost never produce lasting change. They address the behavior without addressing the root. The underlying program is this: I have aspects of myself that are unacceptable. If people see them, I will be rejected. Therefore, I must manage my presentation so carefully that those aspects remain invisible. When the shadow erupts, the shadow, being unconscious, does not follow your instructions. It does not respect your carefully constructed social strategies. It operates on its own timeline, by its own logic, and it has a persistent habit of surfacing at the most inconvenient possible moments. It is the disproportionate anger that rises when someone criticizes you in a way that seems relatively minor, but touches something in you that goes very deep. The fury is not about the criticism. It is about what the criticism threatens to reveal. It is the sudden, irrational jealousy you feel toward someone who seems to be living freely, unapologetically, without apparent concern for what others think. The jealousy is not really about them. It is about the part of you that desperately wants the same freedom but has convinced itself that such freedom is not available. Jung called this phenomenon projection. When we cannot acknowledge something within ourselves, we tend to see it, often with great intensity, in others. Have you ever had a strong, seemingly inexplicable negative reaction to someone? That reaction is almost always a shadow projection. Something in that person reflects something in you that you have not yet integrated. The gifts hidden in the darkness. Now here is where the conversation shifts, because we have been talking about the shadow as a problem to be managed. But Jung's most radical and important claim about the shadow was something entirely different. He believed the shadow was not primarily a problem. He believed it was a gift, a dangerous gift, an uncomfortable gift, a gift that requires extraordinary courage to unwrap, but a gift nonetheless, containing precisely the qualities, the energies, the capacities that you most need in order to become fully yourself. Consider what happens when you reclaim the anger you have been suppressing. Healthy anger is not a character flaw. It is a sophisticated emotional signal. It tells you when your boundaries have been crossed, when your needs are not being met. A person who has integrated their shadow anger does not explode inappropriately. They simply know when to say no. Consider what happens when you reclaim the ambition you were taught to be ashamed of. The shadow ambition, integrated, becomes the fuel for extraordinary work. Consider what happens when you reclaim the sensitivity you were told made you weak. This sensitivity, honored and integrated, becomes one of the most powerful gifts a human being can possess. Every quality in your shadow was put there for a reason, but the reason that was once valid may no longer be. The child who learned to hide their anger to survive an emotionally volatile household is now an adult in a different environment. The shadow does not know this. It is operating on old information, following old rules. Part of shadow integration is simply updating the file. The practice of shadow integration. Jung was clear that shadow integration is not a single event. It is a practice, ongoing, imperfect, requiring continuous attention and genuine courage. It begins with something surprisingly simple: honesty. Ask yourself, what emotions do I consistently avoid feeling? What qualities do I judge most harshly in other people? What have I always wanted but told myself I shouldn't want? What would you do if you knew, with absolute certainty, that no one whose opinion you value would ever find out? That last question is particularly revealing, because what lives in that space, the space between what you would do if observed and what you would do if truly free, is often a map of your shadow. The process of shadow integration has several distinct phases. The first is recognition, simply becoming aware that the shadow exists and beginning to identify its contents. Journaling can be particularly powerful here. Therapy is valuable. Dreams are another doorway. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates most directly through dreams, and that the figures that populate them often represent shadow material seeking integration. The second phase is acknowledgement, moving from simply knowing that certain qualities exist in your shadow to actually feeling them. The third phase is dialogue, beginning to engage with shadow material as if it were a voice worth listening to rather than a threat to be managed. The fourth phase is integration, gradually incorporating shadow qualities into your conscious self-expression in ways that are appropriate and genuinely yours. The shadow in everyday life. You do not need to be in a therapist's office or a meditation retreat to encounter your shadow. It is present in the most ordinary moments of your daily existence. Consider the person who genuinely wants to be generous, who identifies strongly with being giving and helpful, but who periodically experiences surges of resentment toward the very people they are helping. The resentment feels wrong, shameful, so it gets pushed down, suppressed, added to the shadow. But suppressed resentment does not dissolve. It accumulates, and eventually it finds expression in passive aggression, in sudden emotional withdrawal, in the kind of help that carries a subtle, unspoken price tag. Not because the person is dishonest or manipulative, but because the authentic need beneath the resentment was never acknowledged. This is shadow integration in its most practical form, not dramatic revelation. Just the quiet, ongoing practice of being honest with yourself about what is actually present in your experience, including the parts that don't fit the version of yourself you have been trying to maintain. Every time you do this, the shadow loses a little of its underground power, and you gain a little more of yours. What changes when the shadow is integrated? The changes that follow genuine shadow integration are not subtle. The most immediate shift is in the area of approval-seeking itself. When you are no longer desperately afraid of what lies in your own unconscious, when you have looked at your anger, your ambition, your jealousy, your need, and found that you can survive the encounter, the external threat of disapproval loses much of its power. The second shift is in the quality of your relationships. When you stop relating primarily through your persona, the relationships that form are qualitatively different. They can hold complexity, disagreement, difficulty, because they were not built on the fiction of a perfectly acceptable self. The third shift is in your relationship with your own potential. The qualities stored in your shadow are not just emotional material, they are energy. Creative energy, vital energy, the kind of raw life force that gets expressed in genuine passion and genuine creativity. When that energy is integrated, it becomes available, and the effect on what you are capable of is frequently extraordinary. Part 4. The courage to break free. Imagine you have spent years building something extraordinary. Not a business, not a building, something far more fragile and far more valuable, a reputation, a place in the world, a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, a relationship with a mentor so significant, so formative, so deeply woven into the fabric of your professional identity that losing it would feel like losing a part of yourself. Now imagine that everything you have built depends on one thing: your continued agreement with the person at the center of it all. And imagine that you have slowly, painfully, undeniably come to realize that you no longer agree, not on minor points, but on the fundamental questions, the deep ones. What do you do? Do you stay silent? Do you suppress what you know to be true in order to preserve what you have worked so hard to build? Or do you tell the truth? This was the exact situation Carl Jung found himself in during the early years of the 20th century, and the choice he made, the extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily costly, extraordinarily courageous choice he made, changed the history of psychology. The relationship that defined an era. In the early 1900s, Sigmund Freud was not merely a prominent psychiatrist. He was the founder of an entirely new discipline, psychoanalysis, and one of the most influential intellectual figures in the Western world. And Freud had chosen Jung as his successor. This was not a minor distinction. Freud was explicit about it, in letters, in conversations, in public statements. Jung was the designated heir to the psychoanalytic tradition, the man who would carry the work forward when Freud was gone. The relationship between them was intense, intellectually electric, and deeply personal. Freud treated Jung not just as a colleague, but as a son, the brilliant, promising inheritor of everything he had built. Jung, for his part, experienced Freud as the most intellectually stimulating person he had ever encountered, a father figure of enormous psychological significance. For years, the arrangement worked. Jung traveled in Freud's orbit, contributed to the psychoanalytic movement, represented its ideas at conferences and in publications across Europe and America. He was, by any measure, extraordinarily successful. The growing divergence. The tension began with ideas. Freud's model of the human psyche was, at its core, a hydraulic system of biological drives. The primary engine of human behavior, in Freud's framework, was the libido, sexual energy, broadly conceived, seeking expression and being shaped by the forces of repression and socialization. It was a powerful model, elegant, explanatory, and in many respects, genuinely illuminating. But for Jung, it was not enough. Jung's own inner experience, his extraordinarily vivid dreams, his deep encounters with what he called the numinous, his fascination with mythology and the recurring symbolic patterns he observed across radically different cultures, pointed toward something that Freud's framework could not contain. Jung was increasingly convinced that the human unconscious was not merely a repository of personal repressed material. It was something vaster, a deep layer of shared human experience, a collective dimension of the psyche that transcended individual biography. He called this the collective unconscious, and within it he identified recurring universal patterns. He called these archetypes. These ideas were not small refinements to Freud's model. They were, in important respects, incompatible with it, and Freud knew it. He responded, as powerful figures often do when their authority is questioned, with a combination of intellectual pressure and emotional manipulation. He pathologized Jung's disagreement. He turned intellectual divergence into personal failing. The approval at stake. Let's be precise about what Jung stood to lose if he followed his own truth. He stood to lose Freud's approval, the approval of the most important figure in his professional world, a man he genuinely loved and admired. He stood to lose the approval of the entire psychoanalytic community, the colleagues, the collaborators, the intellectual peers who formed his professional social world. He stood to lose his position, the designated succession, the institutional standing, the extraordinary professional platform that his association with Freud had created. He stood to lose his certainty, because following your own truth into genuinely new intellectual territory means leaving behind the safety of established frameworks. This is not a small list of losses. This is, by any reasonable measure, a devastating array of things to risk. And Jung risked them all. The decision and its aftermath. The formal break came in 1913. Jung published Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, a work that reinterpreted the concept of libido in ways fundamentally incompatible with Freud's framework. The response from Freud was swift and final. The warm correspondence ceased almost entirely. The psychoanalytic community largely followed Freud. Jung was accused of mysticism, of irrationality, of retreating from science into religion. His reputation was genuinely damaged. And then something happened that Jung would later describe as the most important and most terrifying period of his life. He descended into a direct, sustained, often overwhelming encounter with the contents of his own deep psyche. He documented this period in what became known as the Red Book, Liber Novus, a remarkable, strange, deeply personal record of his inner journeys during this time. It was genuinely terrifying at times, but it was also, as he understood both during and after, the most important work of his life. Because during those years of isolation, of professional exile, of direct confrontation with his own unconscious, Jung discovered the very things that would become the foundation of his most enduring contributions. What Jung's story is actually about it would be easy to read Jung's rupture with Freud as a story about intellectual courage, one great thinker breaking free from another to pursue his own vision. And it is that. But it is also something more personally relevant. It is a story about the approval trap and the cost of escaping it. Jung had built his entire professional identity in relationship to Freud's approval. Losing it was not just professionally dangerous, it was existentially disorienting. It required Jung to discover whether he had a self that could stand independently of external validation. The answer, as we now know, was a resounding yes. But he could not know that in advance. He had to make the choice before the outcome was visible. He had to follow his own truth into the darkness without any guarantee of what he would find there. This is what genuine authenticity actually requires, not the comfortable kind, the kind that costs nothing, but the real kind, the kind that requires you to continue standing in your truth even when you cannot yet see what standing there will give you. Jung did not leave Freud because he had already found something better waiting on the other side. He left because staying had become incompatible with his integrity. You're Freud. Most of us will never face exactly Jung's situation, but we all have our Freud. The Freud in your life is whatever, or whoever, holds the approval you are most afraid to lose. Perhaps it is a parent whose vision of what your life should look like you have been quietly fulfilling for decades, even as that vision has grown increasingly incompatible with who you actually are. Perhaps it is a relationship, a partner, a close friend, a community, where the price of belonging is a degree of self-suppression that has gradually become unsustainable. Perhaps it is a career, a profession you continue in, not because it feeds you, but because leaving would require explaining yourself to people whose opinion you have decided you cannot afford to lose. Whatever form your Freud takes, the dynamic is the same. There is an approval you have organized your life around maintaining. There are parts of yourself that cannot exist within that approval structure. And there is a quiet, persistent, increasingly insistent voice, the voice of your authentic self, that is asking you whether the approval is worth what you are paying for it. The smaller Freud moments. Jung's rupture with Freud is dramatic precisely because the stakes were so extraordinarily high. Most of us will never face a choice of that magnitude in a single decisive moment, but most of us face smaller versions of it, constantly. The colleague who pushes back when you present an unconventional idea, and the choice between defending your perspective and retreating into safer agreement. The friend group whose shared assumptions you have quietly outgrown. The partner who has a fixed image of who you are and responds to your growth with discomfort. These are not small moments. They are, cumulatively, the moments that determine what kind of life you build. Each one is a micro-version of Jung's choice, approval or authenticity, safety or truth. And the remarkable thing is this: the pattern of how you respond to these small moments is almost perfectly predictive of how you would respond to a large one. The person who has practiced choosing authenticity in low-stakes situations has built the psychological muscle to choose it when the stakes are genuinely high. Jung did not wake up one day and spontaneously possess the courage to break with Freud. He had been, throughout his life, developing the internal architecture that made that courage possible. The courage was built. Incrementally, practice by practice. Yours can be too. The permission you have been waiting for. Perhaps you have been waiting, somewhere in the background of your life, for someone to give you permission. Permission to be different from what is expected of you. Permission to want what you actually want. Permission to step out of the role you have been playing for so long that you can barely remember choosing it. Here is that permission. Not from an authority, not from someone whose approval you are still seeking, from the simplest, most irrefutable fact available. This is your life, the only one you will have. No one else can live it for you. No one else's approval can make it meaningful. No one else's disapproval can make it worthless. It is yours, completely, irrevocably, extraordinarily yours. Live it accordingly. The gift on the other side. Jung's professional isolation lasted several years. The rebuilding of his reputation was slow. The pain of losing the relationship with Freud did not resolve quickly or cleanly, but what emerged from that period was a body of work of extraordinary richness and enduring influence, concepts and frameworks that continue to illuminate human experience more than a century later, a legacy that would simply not exist if Jung had chosen comfort over truth, and, perhaps more personally significant, an inner freedom. A settled, grounded, unshakable relationship with his own authentic self that could not be threatened by disapproval because it was no longer dependent on approval. This is what awaits on the other side of the approval trap. Not a life without difficulty, not relationships free from conflict, but a life that is genuinely yours, decisions that are genuinely yours, a self that is genuinely yours, solid enough at the center that it can bend without breaking, engage without losing itself, connect without disappearing. Part 5. Becoming Yourself. We have traveled a long way together. We began in the place most of us know all too well, the invisible prison of approval-seeking, the exhausting, unconscious, relentless performance of a self designed not to express who we are, but to manage what others think of us. We examined the persona, the social mask that begins as a tool and ends as a trap. We descended into the shadow, the vast, dark, generative repository of everything that got cut off in the process of becoming socially acceptable. And we witnessed, through the extraordinary real-world example of Carl Jung's rupture with Sigmund Freud, what it actually looks like to choose authenticity over approval when the stakes are real. Now we arrive at the destination this entire journey has been moving toward. Not a concept, not a framework, not another layer of understanding to add to what you already know. A life, your actual life, lived from the inside out, grounded in genuine self-knowledge, animated by your authentic values rather than managed by your approval-seeking fears. Jung called this process individuation, and it is the subject of this final and most important chapter. What individuation actually means. The word individuation sounds technical, clinical, abstract, but Jung's meaning was anything but. Individuation, in its simplest and most honest formulation, is the lifelong process of becoming fully, genuinely, completely yourself. Not the self that was shaped by fear, not the self that was optimized for approval, but the deep, original, essential self that has always been present beneath all of that, waiting with extraordinary patience for the conditions that would allow it to emerge. Jung believed that this essential self, what he called the self with a capital S, was not something to be created or constructed. It was something to be discovered, uncovered, returned to, like an archaeological excavation through the layers of conditioning, performance, and fear that have accumulated over a lifetime, gradually revealing the original structure beneath. The individuation journey is not about becoming someone new, it is about becoming someone real. And it begins, always in every case, without exception, with a single act. Honesty, the honesty that changes everything. Not the performed honesty that has become fashionable in our era of curated vulnerability. Not the strategic sharing of selected struggles designed to generate connection while carefully protecting the deepest, most uncomfortable truths. Real honesty, the kind that happens in private, the kind that requires no audience, the kind that is genuinely difficult because it asks you to see yourself clearly, not harshly, not with the punishing voice of the inner critic, but clearly, accurately, without the distortions of either self-inflation or self-deprecation. This kind of honesty begins with a question that sounds simple and is anything but. Who am I, actually? Not who do I want to be, not who do others think I am. Who are you in the silence, in the privacy of your own mind, in the moments before you have calibrated yourself to any particular audience? Most people, when they sit with this question genuinely, encounter something unexpected. Not a clear, coherent answer, but a kind of spaciousness, a quiet that is simultaneously empty and full, unfamiliar and somehow deeply familiar, as if they have arrived for the first time in a very long time at their own address. That quiet is not nothing, it is the beginning of everything, because in that quiet, if you stay long enough, you begin to hear things, preferences you had forgotten you had, opinions that had been suppressed for so long they barely register as opinions anymore, desires that had been classified as unrealistic or inappropriate. You begin to hear your own voice, and for many people that voice is a stranger. The first practice of individuation is simply this: create the conditions in which that voice can be heard, and then listen to it, not once, not occasionally, but as a daily discipline. The 6 practices of individuation. What follows is not a self-help checklist. It is not a program to be completed or a set of boxes to be checked. It is a map of practices, each one pointing toward a different dimension of the individuation journey, each one requiring ongoing engagement rather than one-time application. Practice 1. the daily audit of authenticity. Every day, you make hundreds of micro-decisions about how to present yourself, what to say, what to withhold. Most of these decisions happen so automatically that they barely register as decisions at all. The first practice is to begin making them conscious. At the end of each day, pause and conduct what we might call an authenticity audit. Ask yourself, when today did I say something I didn't mean, or withhold something I did mean, in order to manage someone's response? When today did I feel a clear internal response, an emotion, an opinion, a preference, and override it in favor of what seemed more acceptable? These are not shameful admissions. They are data points. They are the raw material of self-knowledge. And the more honestly and consistently you gather them, the clearer the map of your own approval-seeking patterns becomes, because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see, and you cannot see a pattern you have never bothered to look for. Practice 2. The discipline of genuine stillness. This one is both the simplest and the most consistently avoided. Jung was insistent that genuine self-knowledge requires genuine silence. Not the passive silence of distraction interrupted, but active, deliberate, sustained stillness, the kind in which the noise of external demand and internal chatter gradually settles, and something quieter, something more essential, becomes audible. In our current historical moment, this practice has become almost countercultural. We live in an environment of relentless, algorithmically optimized stimulation. The possibility of genuine inner silence has become, for many people, genuinely uncomfortable. That discomfort is information. What you encounter in genuine stillness is exactly what you have been avoiding by staying busy. The practice is simple. Find 20 minutes each day, early morning often works best, and sit. Without a phone, without a podcast, without an agenda. Simply sit and notice what arises. You do not need to do anything with what arises. Simply notice. Simply be present to your own inner experience with the same quality of open, non-judgmental attention that you would ideally bring to listening to someone you deeply love. Practice. 3. Learning the language of boundaries. Boundary is not a wall. A wall keeps people out entirely. A boundary is something entirely different, a clear, honest, specific communication about where you end and another person begins. It says, this is acceptable to me, and this is not. Boundaries, understood this way, are not barriers to connection. They are the foundation of genuine connection. Because real intimacy requires that both people actually show up as themselves, and you cannot show up as yourself if you have no clear sense of where yourself actually is. The practice of learning boundaries begins small, deliberately, intentionally small. Start by identifying one situation in your current life where you have been saying yes when you mean no. Not the highest stakes situation, the one where saying no would be by any reasonable measure entirely appropriate. Say no, simply, clearly, and with as much warmth as is authentic in the situation. And then notice what happens. Notice whether the predicted catastrophe materializes. And notice how often it does not. Because here is what most approval seekers discover with great surprise the first time they hold a genuine boundary. The relationship does not end. And often, more often than the approval-seeking mind is prepared to believe, the relationship actually deepens. Practice 4. Expressing the unexpressed. One of the most direct and most powerful practices of individuation is deceptively simple. Begin saying what you actually think, not brutally, not without the ordinary care and consideration that human relationships require, but actually, genuinely. This practice has a specific entry point, the moment of internal disagreement. You are in a conversation and something is said that you genuinely disagree with. And then the approval-seeking mechanism activates. Is this the right moment? Will saying this make things awkward? The practice is not to override all of these considerations every time. Social intelligence is real and timing genuinely matters. The practice is to notice when you are silencing yourself, not because the moment is genuinely wrong, but because you are afraid of the response. And in those moments, not all of them, but gradually more of them, to speak anyway. Over time, this practice fundamentally changes the quality of your relationships, because people who know you through your genuine expression know you in a way that people who only encounter your persona never can. And being genuinely known, being actually seen and responded to as yourself, is one of the deepest sources of human satisfaction available. You cannot be genuinely known if you are never genuinely expressed. Practice 5. Conscious engagement with the shadow. The shadow is not approached through willpower or discipline. It responds to attention, to curiosity, to the quality of open, non-judgmental awareness that says, I am willing to see what is here, even if what is here is uncomfortable. There are 3 primary portals through which shadow material becomes accessible. The first portal is emotional intensity. Any time you experience an emotion that seems disproportionate to its apparent trigger, you are likely in the presence of shadow material. When you notice this, instead of immediately trying to manage or suppress the emotion, pause. Ask it a question. What are you actually about? What does this feeling, at its deepest level, point to? The second portal is your judgments of others. The qualities we judge most strongly in other people are reliably connected to our own shadow. When a particular quality in another person generates a disproportionately strong negative reaction, that is worth examining. Take the judgment and turn it inward, not as self-criticism, but as inquiry. The third portal is your unlived life. Pay attention to what draws you, not what you think should draw you, but what genuinely, irrationally, inexplicably calls to you. The creative pursuit you have never given yourself permission to take seriously. The qualities in people you admire most intensely. These attractions are often pointing toward shadow material of a different kind, not the dark aspects, but the bright ones, the unlived potential, the suppressed gifts. Practice 6. Building your internal authority. All of the practices we have explored point toward a single destination, the development of internal authority. Internal authority is not arrogance. It is not the conviction that you are always right. It is something much quieter and much stronger, the settled, grounded, unshakable knowledge that your own experience, your own perception, your own authentic response to the world constitutes valid and important data about reality. Building this internal authority is a practice, not a revelation. Speak yourself to yourself first. Before seeking anyone else's input on a significant decision, take time to fully articulate your own authentic response. Get clear on what you actually think and feel before introducing the potentially distorting influence of other people's perspectives. Honor your own experience. When you notice a feeling, acknowledge it. To yourself first, at minimum. Track your own accuracy. Over time, pay attention to how often your own authentic assessment of situations turns out to be correct. Approval seekers often dramatically underestimate the accuracy of their own judgment, precisely because they have spent years filtering it through external validation before allowing it to count. Cultivate relationships that support authenticity. The people you spend the most time with have an enormous influence on how safe it feels to be genuinely yourself. Invest most deeply in relationships where your authentic self is consistently met with acceptance, curiosity, and genuine interest. The paradox at the heart of individuation. Here is something that Jung observed and that strikes many people as deeply counterintuitive when they first encounter it. The more genuinely yourself you become, the more genuinely connected to other people you become. Not less, more. We have been trained to believe that fitting in, conforming, adapting, managing our presentation to match what others want to see is the path to connection. But this gets it exactly backwards. The persona connects mask to mask. Two people interacting primarily through their social performances can maintain pleasant, functional, even warm relationships, but those relationships have a ceiling. They cannot go very deep because they are not based on contact between two authentic selves. Authenticity connects self to self. When you are genuinely yourself, when you bring your actual opinions, your real emotional responses, your honest perspective and genuine needs into your relationships, you create the possibility of contact that is fundamentally different in quality from anything the persona can produce. Real intimacy, real understanding, real recognition. And here is the remarkable thing. The people who respond positively to your authentic self are the people who are actually capable of genuine connection. The relationships that survive your authenticity, that deepen rather than dissolving when the performance stops, are the relationships worth having. The ones that required the performance to survive were, by definition, not relationships with you. They were relationships with your mask. Losing them, however painful in the short term, is not a loss. It is a clarification. The question you have been avoiding. We are nearing the end of this journey, and before we close, there is a question that needs to be asked directly. Not gently, directly. How much of your life have you already lived in the approval trap? Think about the decisions you have made primarily out of fear of disapproval. The opportunities you did not pursue because they seemed risky or unconventional or difficult to explain to people whose opinion you valued. The relationships you stayed in past the point of genuine health because leaving would have generated judgment. The creative work you never started, the version of yourself you never allowed to fully emerge. This accounting is not intended to generate regret. Regret is not useful here. What has happened, and it happened within the psychological framework you had available at the time. But you are different now. You know things now that you did not know then. You have a map that you did not have before. And the question going forward, the only question that genuinely matters at this point, is not, how much time have I lost? It is, what am I going to do with the time I have left? The people who have already chosen throughout history, and in the present moment, in lives being lived right now, there are individuals who have made the choice we have been describing throughout this entire video. They are not extraordinary people in the sense of being fundamentally different from you. They do not possess some special psychological equipment that you lack. What they have done is that at some point they made a different choice. They chose, in the face of real uncertainty and real risk, to trust their own authentic self over the comfort of external validation. And then they made that choice again, and again, until it became, gradually and imperfectly, their default orientation. There is a writer who spent 15 years producing work she knew was competent and knew was not true, carefully crafted to meet the expectations of editors and readers and the literary culture she was trying to belong to. And then one day she wrote something real, something that came from the part of herself she had been carefully keeping out of the work. It was messier than her polished productions. It was more vulnerable. It was entirely hers. It was the best thing she had ever written. There is a man who spent 2 decades in a career chosen for its respectability and its reliable generation of parental approval, who woke at 50 to the clear, quiet, undeniable recognition that he had been living someone else's life. He began, slowly, to make different choices. The transition was gradual, imperfect, sometimes painful, and on the other side of it, he found something he had not expected. Not the dramatic fulfillment of a cinematic transformation, something quieter and more durable. He found himself. What awaits on the other side? Let's end by talking about what you gain when the trap is broken, not partially, not theoretically, but genuinely, practically, in the lived experience of your daily life. You gain rest, the profound cellular rest of no longer having to maintain a performance, of being able to move through the world without the constant invisible labor of impression management, of arriving in a room as yourself, simply, unperformatively, completely yourself, and discovering that this is enough, that you are enough. You gain clarity. When your decisions are no longer filtered through the question of what others will think, they become remarkably simpler. Not easier, the choices themselves may be just as difficult, but clearer. Because you are consulting one source instead of many, your own authentic self-knowledge, you gain genuine relationships. The relationships that form between authentic selves are qualitatively different from anything the persona can produce. They can hold the full complexity of two real people, the agreements and the disagreements, the warmth and the friction, the growth and the difficulty. They are, in a word that gets overused but remains precise here, real. You gain creative freedom. As you integrate the shadow, as the suppressed energy of disowned qualities becomes available to your conscious life, you discover capacities you did not know you had, the creativity that was classified as impractical, the passion that was deemed excessive, the originality that was suppressed in favor of what was already approved of. All of it becomes available. All of it becomes fuel. You gain, most fundamentally, yourself. The self that has always been there, beneath the performance, waiting with the particular patience of things that are fundamentally real and therefore do not require external conditions to justify their existence. The self that is yours, genuinely and completely yours, in a way that no achievement, no relationship, no amount of external validation can either create or take away. The invitation. We have covered an enormous amount of ground together, from the neuroscience of the approval trap to the architecture of the persona, from the depths of the shadow to the heights of Jung's own individuation journey, from abstract psychological framework to concrete daily practice. But all of it, every concept, every insight, every framework and practice and story, has been pointing at a single thing: you, the real you, the one that exists beneath the performance, the one that has been waiting, with extraordinary patience and extraordinary resilience, for the conditions that would allow it to emerge fully into your life. Those conditions are not determined by external circumstances. They are not dependent on the approval of anyone whose opinion you have been seeking. They require only one thing: your willingness to begin, today, with whatever small, imperfect, genuine step is available to you right now. That step is enough. It has always been enough. Take it. A final word Carl Jung wrote, near the end of his long life, something that has stayed with me, and that I want to leave you with as we close this journey together. He said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not to achieve what others deem impressive, not to earn the approval of the people whose opinion you have been managing, not to successfully maintain the performance for as long as possible without being seen through, to become who you truly are. That becoming is not a destination you arrive at and then stop. It is a direction you orient toward and then keep moving in, every day, through every choice. In every moment when you are offered the familiar comfort of the approval trap or the uncertain, sometimes frightening, ultimately liberating freedom of your own authentic life, the choice is always yours. It will always be yours. Choose accordingly. If this journey has stirred something real in you, if something in these words has touched a part of yourself that you recognize and want to return to, we invite you to continue the exploration at Timeless Audiobooks Studio. This channel exists for people who are ready to stop performing and start living. Like this video if it reached you. Leave a comment, not a performative one, but a real one. Subscribe. If you want to keep going deeper, your support makes this work possible. Take care of yourself. We'll see you in the next one.